Jimmy Page spent decades setting a standard that seemed untouchable. Led Zeppelin didn't just dominate rock music, they redefined what was possible when four musicians found perfect chemistry. Page had watched countless bands try to capture even a fraction of what Led Zeppelin achieved, only to fall short of that impossible mark. So when he openly declared another band worthy of standing alongside that legendary status, the music world stopped everything to listen. This wasn't casual praise thrown around in some forgotten interview. It came from someone who had personally witnessed the rise and fall of rock's greatest acts, someone who knew exactly what separated true greatness from mere talent. The band he chose shocked everyone who heard his answer. Even more surprising was the specific reason he gave for placing them on that elevated level. But understanding why Page made such a bold statement requires going back to where it all began. In 1944, James Patrick Page was born in the London suburb of Heston, though his family soon relocated to Epsom in Surrey. Their new home on Miles Road held a mystery that would unknowingly reshape rock history. Hidden somewhere in the house was an old Spanish acoustic guitar. Nobody ever discovered how it got there or who it belonged to. Perhaps the previous owners forgot it during their move. Maybe it was left behind by a visiting musician years earlier. The truth was never uncovered, but that forgotten instrument was about to change everything. At first, 12-year-old Jimmy showed little interest in the dusty guitar sitting in the corner. It remained untouched for months until boredom finally drove him to pick it up and strum a few random chords. A school friend taught him some basic finger positions, but that simple lesson sparked something extraordinary. Within weeks, Page had surpassed everything his friend could teach him. He became obsessed with learning songs by ear, spending hours figuring out guitar parts from records. What started as a way to kill time quickly consumed his entire existence. School became an unwelcome distraction from his musical education. Page carried his guitar everywhere, practicing between classes and during lunch breaks until frustrated teachers began confiscating the instrument. The deputy head, Miss Nicholson, became particularly vocal about her disapproval, dismissing his musical ambitions as a waste of time that would never amount to anything meaningful. Her skepticism only strengthened his resolve. At 15, the minimum legal age for leaving school in Britain, Page walked away from formal education to pursue the one thing that truly mattered to him. His teachers were convinced he was making a catastrophic mistake. History would prove them spectacularly wrong, though the road ahead held challenges none of them could have imagined. Neil Christian discovered the teenage guitarist and offered him something that seemed like a dream opportunity. Christian's band, the Crusaders, needed a guitar player for their upcoming tour, and Page eagerly accepted the invitation. For a 15-year-old who lived and breathed music, the chance to play professionally felt like validation of every choice he had made. The reality of life on the road, however, was far removed from the glamorous fantasy he had imagined. For 2 grueling years, Page endured conditions that would have broken most musicians twice his age. The band traveled in cramped, uncomfortable vans with minimal food and even less money. Sleep came in cheap lodgings when they could afford them, or in the vehicles themselves when they couldn't. The constant touring schedule left no time for rest or recovery, and Page's health began deteriorating under the relentless pressure. Exhaustion became his constant companion, but he pushed through every performance, determined to prove himself worthy of the opportunity. The breaking point came when his body finally surrendered to the punishment. A severe case of glandular fever forced him off the tour and back to his family home to recover. At the time, it felt like a devastating failure, the end of his professional music career before it had truly begun. Page spent weeks bedridden, wondering if he would ever get another chance to make music his living. What he couldn't have known was that this apparent setback was actually redirecting him towards something far more significant. Unable to return to touring, Page discovered London's thriving recording studio scene. Session work offered a different kind of musical education, one that would prove invaluable in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Studios needed reliable guitarists who could quickly learn songs, adapt to different styles, and deliver professional results under pressure. Page possessed all of these qualities, and his reputation spread rapidly through London's tight-knit music community. Since another session player was already known as Big Jim Sullivan, the younger musician earned the nickname Lil Jim P to avoid confusion. By the mid-1960s, Page had become one of Britain's most sought-after session guitarists. His versatility allowed him to work across multiple genres, and his professionalism kept him constantly employed. He recorded with The Who, The Kinks, and the Rolling Stones, contributing guitar parts that helped define some of the era's most memorable songs. He even played in the Beatles' 1964 film A Hard Day's Night, adding another prestigious credit to his rapidly expanding resume. But perhaps his most cherished session from this period came when he joined Shirley Bassey's recording of the James Bond theme Goldfinger at Abbey Road Studios. Years later, Page would still describe it as one of the highlights of his pre-Led Zeppelin career. Not every recording session inspired the same level of enthusiasm. During one particularly mind-numbing session for Engelbert Humperdinck's hit Release Me, Page and Big Jim Sullivan grew so bored with the repetitive material that they passed time between takes playing pocket chess. The experience perfectly captured how routine much of the session work had become. Page later claimed he was working 3 sessions per day, 5 days a week at his busiest period, appearing on an estimated 50 to 90% of all recordings made in Britain between 1963 and 1965. The workload was staggering, but it was also becoming creatively suffocating. The final straw came when someone offered him work on a Muzak recording session. The thought of his guitar skills being reduced to background elevator music felt like the ultimate insult to everything he had worked toward. That assignment convinced him it was time for a dramatic change. In 1966, after years of polite invitations, Page finally accepted an offer to join the Yardbirds as their lead guitarist. The decision marked a crucial turning point, moving him from anonymous studio work to center stage with one of Britain's most respected rock bands. The Yardbirds already boasted an impressive legacy, having previously featured Eric Clapton during their early years. Although Clapton had departed before Page arrived, the band's reputation for showcasing exceptional guitarists remained intact. For a brief but magical period, Page shared the stage with Jeff Beck, creating one of rock music's most formidable guitar partnerships. 2 future legends performing together in the same band represented a once-in-a-lifetime collaboration that would never be repeated. During this same period, an interesting idea was taking shape behind the scenes. Page had participated in informal jam sessions with Jeff Beck, John Entwistle from The Who, and Keith Moon, also from The Who. The 4 musicians discussed forming a supergroup that would combine their individual talents into something unprecedented. The project never materialized beyond those early conversations, but it left behind one memorable contribution to rock history. Keith Moon jokingly suggested they call themselves Led Zeppelin, playing off John Entwistle's prediction that the project would go down like a lead balloon. Manager Peter Grant later recommended dropping the to avoid mispronunciation, creating the name that would eventually become legendary. By 1968, the Yardbirds had completely disintegrated, leaving Page as the sole remaining member of a band that no longer existed. Unfortunately, the group still had contractual obligations to fulfill, including several scheduled performances in Scandinavia. With virtually no preparation time, Page hastily assembled a new lineup to honor those commitments. He recruited John Paul Jones, a fellow session musician he knew from their studio days, then added an unknown singer named Robert Plant and his recommended drummer, John Bonham. This temporary group performed under the name the New Yardbirds, never suspecting they were witnessing the birth of something extraordinary. The chemistry between these 4 musicians was undeniable from their very first rehearsal. Page recognized immediately that he had stumbled upon something far more significant than a temporary solution to fulfill contractual obligations. The energy, the musical telepathy, the way their individual talents merged into something greater than the sum of its parts, this was exactly what he had been searching for without even realizing it. Rather than treat this as a brief arrangement, Page decided to gamble everything on this unexpected discovery. Believing completely in the potential he witnessed during those early rehearsals, Page used his own money to fund recording sessions. The fortune he had accumulated during years of session work was about to be invested in what many would have considered a risky venture. He booked studio time and guided the band through the creation of their debut album in just 36 hours of recording time. The speed of the process reflected not carelessness, but rather the incredible musical connection these 4 men had forged almost instantaneously. When Atlantic Records heard the completed album, they offered Led Zeppelin one of the largest recording contracts in music history. The deal included a $143,000 advance, worth approximately $1.25 million in today's currency, while granting the band unprecedented creative control over their music, artwork, and touring decisions. Perhaps even more remarkable was Atlantic's willingness to commit to this arrangement without ever seeing Led Zeppelin perform live. They were betting entirely on the power of what they heard on those recordings. Behind the scenes, manager Peter Grant was constructing a protective fortress around the band's interests. A former wrestler and nightclub bouncer, Grant used his intimidating physical presence and shrewd business sense to secure better deals for Led Zeppelin than most bands could even imagine. His aggressive negotiation style changed how the music industry treated artists, helping musicians gain greater control over their careers and financial futures. Grant's influence extended far beyond Led Zeppelin, reshaping the relationship between performers and the business machinery that surrounded them. Led Zeppelin's impact on rock music was immediate and revolutionary. Their debut album demonstrated that heavy blues-based rock could achieve both commercial success and artistic credibility. They proved that audiences were hungry for music that was simultaneously powerful and sophisticated, laying the groundwork for everything that would follow in hard rock and heavy metal. Page's innovative guitar techniques, combined with Plant's vocal range, Jones's musical versatility, and Bonham's thunderous drumming, created a template that countless bands would attempt to replicate. But Page understood something that many of his imitators missed completely. Simply copying Led Zeppelin's surface elements would never be sufficient to achieve lasting success. The band's greatness came from their willingness to constantly evolve, to push boundaries, and to treat their influences as starting points rather than destinations. This philosophy would later inform his assessment of which contemporary bands truly understood what made great rock music endure. Years after Led Zeppelin's end, Jimmy Page found himself searching for musicians who truly understood what made great rock music transcend mere imitation. He had witnessed countless bands attempt to recreate Led Zeppelin's magic by borrowing surface elements while missing the deeper philosophy that had driven their innovation. Then he discovered a group that approached classic rock with the same spirit of evolution and authenticity that had defined his own career. When asked directly about bands worthy of standing alongside Led Zeppelin's legacy, Page gave an answer that surprised everyone who heard it. The Black Crowes, he declared, represented everything he believed great rock music should be. This wasn't the choice most people expected. Many assumed he would name a more obvious candidate from rock's established hierarchy. Instead, Page chose a band that had emerged from Atlanta in the late 1980s, bringing blues-based rock into the modern era without simply copying what had come before. The Black Crowes understood that honoring musical traditions meant building upon them, not merely repeating them. What impressed Page most was their genuine understanding of the musical foundations that had shaped Led Zeppelin itself. The Black Crowes drew from the same blues and folk influences that had inspired him decades earlier, but they filtered those elements through their own contemporary perspective. Songs like Hard to Handle and Twice as Hard demonstrated their deep knowledge of rock history while maintaining their own distinctive identity. They weren't trying to become the new Led Zeppelin, they were becoming the first Black Crowes. This philosophy aligned perfectly with Page's long-held belief about musical evolution. He had always maintained that the greatest bands treated their influences as launching pads rather than limitations. Led Zeppelin itself had achieved legendary status by combining blues, folk, hard rock, and experimental sounds into something entirely new. The Black Crowes followed that same approach, respecting the past while pushing toward the future. When Page eventually collaborated with the Black Crowes on tour, the experience rekindled his excitement about live performance in ways he hadn't felt since Led Zeppelin's peak years. Playing classic songs like In My Time of Dying and 10 Years Gone with musicians who genuinely understood their spirit felt like discovering those compositions anew. The Black Crowes brought their own energy and interpretation to the material while maintaining the essential elements that made those songs timeless. Jimmy Page's choice revealed something crucial about artistic greatness. The bands that truly deserve to be mentioned alongside legends like Led Zeppelin aren't the ones that perfectly mimic their predecessors. Instead, they're the groups that understand why those influences mattered and use that knowledge to create something authentically their own. In the Black Crowes, Page found musicians who honored rock history while writing its next chapter, proving that the spirit of innovation he had championed throughout his career was alive and thriving in a new generation.